Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Radical Candor podcast. I'm Kim Scott.
And I'm Jason Rosoff.
I'm Amy Sandler. Before we get into it today, I want to let you know we've got some great new podcast merch. Thank you, Brandy. Go ahead to radicalcandor.com/podcast. If you click on the Radical Candor Podcast Swag Collection, you're going to see stickers and magnets, totes. I mean, who doesn't love a tote and a mouse pad? All right. If you are living in the world today, you are probably having some political conversations about the rapidly approaching, unprecedented US presidential election, which is continuing to play out daily like a Hollywood movie. So we thought we would talk today about the topic of talking about politics at work. There was a 2024 survey from Resume Help, and it noted that it's a topic that's making people pretty uncomfortable. So more than half, 51% of workers say they never or rarely discuss politics at work. Almost half, 45%, have regretted having political discussions at work. 23%, so almost a quarter of people have decided actually not to apply to a company's job listing because of the company's political stance. And a quarter have left or wanted to leave their job because of their boss's political beliefs. And just about half, 51%, believe that workplace political discussions are hurting the work environment. There's some interesting differences. Folks younger than 45 are more likely, more comfortable talking about politics than older folks. And women have reported feeling that political discussions impact the workplace more negatively. 57% of women have reported that versus 44% of men. But this is across the board a challenging topic. So we thought we would check in on where we are today, 2024. Because Kim, in a blog post, you wrote this back 7 years ago in 2017, shortly after the 2016 election. You gave this advice, and I'm curious if you still feel this way. So you said, quote, "It's hard to be a minority voice in a supermajority. It's hard to be a conservative in Silicon Valley. And I imagine it was hard to be one of the 5 people in King County, Texas, who voted for Clinton. This difficulty is tearing our nation, our companies, our friendships, and our families apart. Today, try to have a radically candid political conversation, one in which you challenge somebody's political position, but still show you care about that person." How is that landing for you today?
So I think that it's interesting. I was speaking with a group of HR leaders who said they dreaded this election cycle because it was going to kill productivity. And so I think that is a shame. Our election should not kill productivity in the rest of our lives, and it shouldn't also hurt our relationships so much. We should be able to talk to each other respectfully and to disagree respectfully. In fact, I think that John Stuart Mill put it well. I'm not going to quote him, but basically he said, if you're not willing to be challenged on beliefs, even beliefs that you have no intention of changing your mind about, those beliefs are likely to become prejudices. And so there's a great deal of benefit to having these disagreements, even if we don't change our minds, because we deepen our own thinking and we think in a more flexible way when we're willing to be challenged. Now, I think if I had to edit, so there's part of me that agrees with what I wrote back in 2017. I would say try to be challenged today. Don't go out and I would say follow the order of operations. Solicit feedback before you offer it if you have disagreements. I also think there's a whole host of things that we don't need to agree about in order to work well together. And so we don't have to have these conversations all the time, which is very different from saying we should ban political speech at work. So, for example, there was someone I worked with, and without saying what my belief is, but you can probably guess, we had very different points of view about gun control. And yet we worked extremely well together, because you know what? We were not we were not we were not making guns to it. Like, it was not relevant. The issue of gun control was not relevant to the issue of making software together. So there's all kinds of situations where it's possible to work, and we didn't pretend like we agreed. It wasn't like we never talked about it, but we didn't talk about it all the time because it just didn't come up.
I would build on that by saying any topic that is close enough to our sense of self, like, we tend to associate our politics with our identity. The other topic that came to mind was parenting. I've seen people get into, like, ruin relationships at work having conversations about parenting. And this was not necessarily because they strongly, even from an outsider's perspective, like, they didn't even strongly disagree. They just felt like the places where they did disagree made them so different that they had a hard time working together, even though parenting had nothing to do with what we were.
Yeah, they
were
weren't
also making
raising
software.
children together.
Exactly. So I think we would never consider discourage. You know what I'm saying? It would never occur to us to say, don't talk about parenting at work. But somehow with politics, we're like, we feel like somehow that's meaningfully different. But I think your point is a good one, Kim, which is like, I think there's a difference between, as you're saying, between banning or even discouraging people from talking about topics that might touch on someone's identity or experience, and going out and seeking those conversations. Like, those are two very different things. And I think there are a lot of people who are considering banning or discouraging people from talking about politics at work, and I think that that's likely to backfire.
So back in 2020, we recorded a podcast with Tiffany Lee, and Tiffany and I talked about the fact that both her father and my father had said that we shouldn't talk about race, religion, and politics at work. And I think that kind of ban of big topics at work made it harder for people to relate to one another, and made people feel like they were having to dance around things. I don't think that was a helpful ban. But I also am not saying go out and pick fights about race, religion, and politics at work. Like, that is not helpful. But I think, Jason, to your point of view about parenting, a story that I talk about in Radical Respect is a time when I was working with this guy and we're chit-chatting before a meeting, and I had just returned to work from parental leave, and having had twins 5 months previously. And this was like my second day back in the office. So we're chit-chatting, and this guy says to me, "Oh, well, my wife doesn't work because it's better for the children." And at that moment, for me, that was like a gut punch. And this is not exactly political speech, but it's not exactly not political speech also. And but I didn't think he really meant it the way that it sounded. So I tried to make a joke. I tried to use what in Radical Respect I call an I statement. I said, "Oh, I decided to show up at work today because I wanted to neglect my children." And I was expecting him to laugh and apologize and we would move on. But no, he doubled down and he said, "Oh no, Kim, it's really bad for your children that you've decided to come back to work." So now I know that this is really a belief that he has. And it's much harder to deal with a belief that you fundamentally disagree with than it is an unconscious bias. And so I used an it statement. I said, "It is an HR violation for you, or a company violation for you to tell me that I'm neglecting my kids by showing up at work." And of course it was at that company. And what I was trying to do with that it statement is show that there's a boundary between one person's freedom to believe whatever they want, but they can't impose that belief on others. And I did not want to get into a conversation with him about childbearing because it was not relevant to but I did want to uh, make it clear that he couldn't impose he could believe whatever he wanted, but he couldn't impose that belief on me. And saying that had the desired impact. He backed off. And then I said to him, furthermore, it's my decision together with my spouse how we raise our kids, just as it is your decision together with your wife how you raise yours. And so again, we don't need to argue this point, but let's just use some common sense to remember who's responsible for what. And what, when you can bring your beliefs from your personal life to work and when you can't. And it was important to have that much of a conversation with him, because if I hadn't, first of all, I would have resented him. So I would have been angry. And so I think raising it was important. And it was important to let him know that he didn't get to decide, whether or not I should travel, for example. He didn't think I should. And so I think for practical reasons as well as for emotional reasons, it's worth having enough of a conversation to make it clear where those boundaries are. But if I had worked more closely with him, or if I had been more friendly with him, I might have wanted to, read his research and share my research with him. But as it was, we didn't need to do that. We didn't need to have that much conversation.
Kim, I wonder, as you say that and having examples of the boundaries, like what's popping up for me is, and those HR folks that you were talking to are talking about productivity. Like, what if you're a manager and you're leading a team meeting and someone's wearing a baseball cap or a shirt that has a political slogan, or they put in the Slack, like, I'm doing this fundraiser or this Zoom for this or that candidate? Like, how do managers and companies kind of writ large think about boundaries of not banning speech, but where some people might feel like even advocating for a certain candidate might actually be an expression of going against someone else's identity? It
Yeah.
might land that way.
Yeah. So I think that there's no objective measure for this. I can't tell you where the right boundary is for your team. But what I can say is that as a manager, I think it's a really good idea to make it clear where that boundary is, and decide, are we going to ask people not to wear T-shirts with slogans for one candidate or another, or is that okay? And if it's okay on one side, is it okay on both sides? I mean, there are some leaders who will declare who they're voting for, and I've had a lot of conversations about whether that's the right thing or the wrong thing to do. I'm inclined to be very open about what I believe, and uh, and yet I can also respect a point of view that says, as a leader, you're not allowed to put pressure. I certainly would never put pressure on people who they should vote for, or even ask them who they're voting for. But I can understand how some people might say, Kim, you should keep who you're voting for to yourself. So I don't know. I don't think there's a right answer to where the boundary is. But what I do think is important is that you make it clear where the boundary is for you and your team.
Jason, how do you think about that for Radical Candor?
I think we try to encourage people to be willing to respectfully discuss any point of view. I think it's important to me that if someone, there are people on our team who have different perspectives, but the moment I think the important thing to distinguish is like, can we talk about the idea, right? Like, are we talking about the idea, or are we talking about particular people and individuals' choices? So, for example, extending, Kim, your example of talking about, child rearing at work, I think there's a parallel to that, which is you might have a differing perspective on immigration policy, for example, right? People can have different perspectives on, what does border security mean? What should immigration policy look like in the United States? Those, I think, are important political questions. But if that veers into someone saying, immigrants are killing our country, right? It's not about the policy anymore. It's not the idea of the thing anymore. It's about turning that into an accusation about people for me, like that's the line that I would enforce, and not necessarily to say you are fired or that speech is banned and you can't say that, but to say, I think it's important that if we're going to talk about politics, that we talk about ideas, we don't personalize these things, and it's important that you and I, whoever this person is, have a conversation about how that particular statement or point of view has a discriminatory effect, like how it could negatively affect other people at the company and the company itself.
I would say we wouldn't essentialize about some group of people, any group of people.
That's right. In the same way that we don't want to essentialize, I would say Radical Candor as a company leans more classically sort of like liberal or progressive. And we're very conscious of not essentializing conservatives, right? Like we try not to have conversations where we say, people who aren't like us, like
or who disagree about this policy,
correct, are somehow less than. We diminish. We don't diminish the people. I think to me, that's the line. Like the moment it becomes essentializing, you've crossed a line away from a political discussion and into a personal attack.
And by essentializing, at least what I mean, so I want to make sure we have the same definition. What I mean is saying all the people of this group share some trait, which of course is almost never true. Is never true, really.
Yep.
There was, Kim, we had a recent podcast with Guy Kawasaki, and he shared one of his podcast episodes and folks that he spoke with. I believe it was Mark Laberton. And the guidance was, when you are dealing with someone with opposing viewpoints, to ask, like, how did you get to believing what you believe rather than why? And I thought that was such an instructive way to think about that, so that it really is coming from this place of curiosity. And I do think there's some real, when you think about the Radical Candor framework, and you were saying, like, starting by asking for feedback and asking questions and really being curious. So, to me, it seems like that curiosity and sort of how is it that somebody got to that belief can be a helpful way to build a bridge. I wonder if you have any other guidance from what you've observed with your conversations over the past few years with Radical Respect about how to build a bridge, maybe with folks that might have opposing viewpoints.
Yeah. So I think the first question is, do you need to build a bridge, or do you just need to make it clear where the boundary is? Like, you don't have to talk about, how did you come to believe what you believe about whatever policy that probably carries some emotional weight with it. You don't have to have that conversation in order to make the boundary clear, but also, in other words, we're not going to essentialize, but also to respect that other people have other points of view. So I think that one of the mistakes that I have made in the past is to assume that everybody thinks the same way I do, which is a kind of bias. And so making sure, if I am going to state my position about something, I want to say, I want to acknowledge that other people might think differently about it, and I'm open to other people's beliefs. So there's that. And then if I do want to have that conversation, Amy, I think saying how rather than why can feel can elicit more stories about the person's life. That's part of why I liked, how did you come to believe that? And so why feels a little bit skeptical. Like, why do you believe that? You're wrong, is kind of the unstated, or I disagree. And I think the most important thing is to remember that we can disagree with each other and still respect each other enormously. We can have what Martin Buber calls an I-thou relationship. In other words, I am a lot more than my belief on policy X, policy Y, policy Z. I'm a human being, and we share. Even if we disagree on some pretty fundamental issues, we probably share more than we disagree with. And remembering to take a step back and look at the whole person. I told this story at TEDx Portland, where I was asked to give a Radical Candor talk for a policy group, and revealing my bias. I assumed that, policy, how interesting. They must advocate for all the policies that I agree with. And right before I was getting on a plane to go, I was like, oh, these are not the policies that I agree with. And I had a conversation with them before, and I said, if you look at this was when I was still using Twitter all the time. I was like, if you look at my Twitter feed, you'll see that you'll notice that I disagree with a lot. And they're like, that's all right. Reasonable people can disagree. And as I was giving the talk, there were really good questions, good engagements. And I had this very clear thought, like, these people are my fellow citizens. These are not my enemies. And then I was like, why did I think of them as my enemy? Like, have I gotten so far down the polarized path that I would think of this group of people as, and it was kind of like a moment in my mind, but then the moment passed and the talk was over, and somebody came up to me and said to me, oh, do you believe X about policy Y? And I said yes, and a few more questions. And as I could tell that this person who was asking me this disagreed with me. And eventually the person kind of cocked their head and said, you don't seem evil. And I would have thought that they were ridiculous, except that I had just had more or less the same thought. And I think we've gotten to this place where we assume these strange things about one another. And I would love for us all to take a collective breath and to remember that we can disagree vehemently with one another and still have that radical respect, that unconditional regard for our shared humanity.
Yeah, I think part of the problem is that like American politics seems to be stuck in a constant election cycle. So elections are about differences, and politics are about like areas of agreement. Like the work of politics is finding the places where you agree that you can collectively move the ball forward. And and if you're constantly like, and I don't blame people for this, because I find myself falling into the same trap that you described, Kim, which is like thinking that the most important thing is to stake out our differences. But that's not how progress is made at work or in politics or in relationships. Like you don't make progress with other people by focusing entirely on your differences, which seems so trivial to say, but it is like a pattern that we have that we seem to find ourselves in. And I think it is in part due to the sort of like constant obsessive election cycle politics that we find ourselves in.
Yes, I was having dinner with a group of people the other day who were voting for different candidates. And somebody said, Republicans and Democrats, we all fix potholes more or less the same way. And I think that's really, I liked that.
Jason, I was curious, when Kim was talking about the example of, working well with someone who had a different view on, say, gun control. Have you had any experiences working with someone effectively where there was a really clear difference in beliefs, maybe even that impacted identity? Do any of those stories pop to mind of how you navigated that might be helpful?
I've worked with people who are far more liberal than me. I haven't worked with interestingly, like where I grew up, like relatively conservative. My family is relatively conservative. A lot of places I've worked have, been, I would say, leaned liberal. And I think the example that's coming to mind was around the 2016 election, and there were some. My role was as chief product and chief people officer at the time. So this is like an interesting line for me to try to walk. But there are some people who believed so strongly in like a particular political view that they were suggesting that we make company changes in order to support that political view. I don't want to get into the details so that the people can remain innocent. me included.
Or anonymous, anyway.
Anonymous, yes. They were innocent to begin with. Anonymous. And it was actually really challenging because I said, I agree with you, like in principle, that there's a debate about this particular policy. And I don't agree that it's settled, nor do we know exactly what the right thing to do is. So like changing company policy based on this particular stance, it was related to immigration and how we and when we hired people who required visas. And I said, I'm unsure that changing this policy is actually going to be better for any of the people who work here or for the people that we would hire. And so I'm being conservative in this moment by not changing this, by saying we're not going to change this policy because I want to see how this actually shakes out, like what the actual impact is, so that we can figure out how to adjust the policy effectively if we need to. And the person certainly respected my point of view, but they were not dissuaded from continuing to challenge me on this particular point of view. We over the course of 2017, we had like a series of conversations that I mean, their argument was pretty persuasive, and I didn't wind up changing the policy before I left, but I suspect I would have been convinced over time that they were right. And it certainly created some tension in our relationship, but I think actually having the respectful discourse about it and my not turning them away, my not saying I'm unwilling to be challenged on this idea, actually created, deepened up one bond. Like we knew we weren't going to be friends. You know what I'm saying? We knew we didn't see eye to eye on everything, but there was a bond that formed in that disagreement, right? That the respectful disagreement. There was a mutual acknowledgement of our shared humanity, and I suspect that that person to this day is good at persuading the leaders that they work for to consider changes in their policies.
I think that silence that is dangerous around race, religion, and politics. I think that especially in a world in which some people have more power than others, that silence around these topics feels threatening and dangerous. It's when I was writing Radical Respect, I had a couple of days, I don't know why this happened, where I just kept listening to the sounds of silence. And there's the old Simon and Garfunkel, but then there's the new version of the sounds of silence. I think you sent it to me, Amy.
I think I did. It was like it was like a metal Disturbed. Yes, is what it was done by Disturbed.
We'll drop a link in, and I must have listened to that like 100 times because I think, Amy, you and I so believe we both long for harmony. And I think part of what Radical Candor does for both of us is it helps us get to harmony by talking, not by avoiding topics. And I think that part of the reason, at least and I'm not sure I believe this, so let's experiment with this belief. But I think that part of the reason why we're at this moment where we are so polarized is because there are so many conversations that didn't happen over the last 30 or 40 years. And it's sort of like self-organizing criticality. So the idea of self-organizing criticality, this is a study of sand piles and how sand piles reach stability. And if you let one grain of sand fall at a time, then there's a lot of little avalanches. And that's how you find stability. It's like a lot of little arguments are how you find stability in a relationship. Whereas wetting the sand is sort of like silence or refusal to speak about the topic. It feels like harmony for a while, and the sand pile builds up and then it collapses. And when it collapses catastrophically or in more dramatically. So I'd rather have a lot of little arguments to get to peace than silence and then one big fight, because the big fight can be can end badly. I'll put it that way. It's harder to recover from a big fight than a lot of little disagreements.
Kim, I was thinking as you were describing that, the other sort of metaphor or image that was coming up with the sand and the water was like, just in this era of social media and algorithms and snippets, that we get these little descriptors, and then we, to your point of essentializing, then we paint a whole picture of who that person is
Yes.
from a 10-second snippet, rather than really looking at, this sort of full spectrum of their humanity. And I think that one of the reasons I think radical candor is more important than ever, it's not just the common human decency, but looking at the full picture of who this person is day in and day out, and all these other ways that we might be able to connect with them. And yet the only sort of thing we might see is the hat or the t-shirt, and then we
Yeah.
sort of ascribe a whole thing. So I think to that idea of being really specific of like this, it's this one thing I might, but I'm putting on a whole personality on top of, and that's kind of where I thought you were going with the sandcastle, was it
Yeah.
was like this one speck of sand, and then I decide that means a whole type of human.
Yeah, in the documentary Origin, which is about the writing of the book Cast, there's this wonderful scene where the plumber is wearing a "Make America Great Again" hat, and she just decides. And in the book, it's even more powerful than in the documentary. But she decides that she, being the author, Isabel Wilkerson, decides that I'm looking over my shoulder because here's the book. Decides that she's going to just appeal to the shared humanity with this person, and she talks about the loss of her mother and her husband, and she makes herself vulnerable. And then he fixes the he fixes the plumbing, and which he had been sort of like, oh, you'll have to call, and and it's such an important moment where we're not gonna allow this one thing, the hat the guy's wearing,
Mhm.
to get in the way of noticing uh, uh, a shared humanity. And there's no one rule that I can think of that I would recommend to managers. I think some managers out there are going to want to say, don't wear political garb to work, and others will say, do. During the 2020 election, there were a lot of companies that allowed Black Lives Matter T-shirts, but didn't allow "Make America Great Again" T-shirts, and that's not an unreasonable position, but they had to explain the position. That one was about sort of human rights, and the other was about politics. So so there's no right or wrong answer. I think the key thing is to be clear about
Mhm.
where that line is between one person's freedom to believe whatever they want, but how do you define imposing a belief on others on your team? Make that clear to folks. I mean, and I don't. Maybe we should try it here. I don't know that we have actually. I advise other people to do it, but I don't think we've really done it.
Yeah, I think in part because if someone asks the question, do we, for example, I'd like to, wear a Black Lives Matter T-shirt or a MAGA hat or whatever. I think we would answer it. I think your point is it's helpful to be proactive, and I think you're not going to get because you can't define because there's subjectivity here. I think it's hard to define a policy ahead of time. I think it's easier to answer. It may be more helpful for the policy to be, political expression is the election is coming up. Political expression is a part of the of being a citizen of the United States. We want to find a way for people to feel comfortable and confident engaging in political expression within some boundaries at work. We don't know exactly what those boundaries are. So if there's something that you want to do, if you want to raise money, talk to us and we'll figure out the right way to help you do that. Or not do it if we think it's not something that is going to be helpful or productive to talk about at work. I struggle to imagine the policy that you could write ahead of time that would say all these expressions are fine and these expressions aren't fine.
Yeah.
Well, I think you could write ahead of time a policy that said, don't wear T-shirts or hats that advocate for one candidate or another. Or you could say it's fine to do that. Like, I think that's something you could kind of decide ahead of time, whether it's okay.
I think yes, I think that's true. You certainly could define it ahead of time. I think if you haven't been asked the question, then maybe the right thing to do is ask the question yourself, which is like, is there something that people want to do in this election cycle so that we can figure out what that policy should be? Because I think it's sort of like, it weirdly invites a disagreement to say like, this is allowed or this is not allowed. Like maybe that's what you want to do. Maybe you want to have that conversation, but setting a policy without having the conversation with the team first seems like
I think you should have a conversation with the team first. But I do think it's useful to have that conversation before you're in the heat of the moment. Like I was talking to several leaders during the last election where something happened, and they're like, and now they have half the team mad about this and the other half of the team mad about that, and they sort of wished they had thought about it before they were in the heat of the moment.
So this is a helpful moment right now. We're recording this in August 2024 for folks to be proactive beyond what we've already discussed. Kim or Jason, going back to Kim, those HR folks you were talking to who are concerned about the productivity lag or drop in the next few months, besides being as clear as you can, besides reaching out to folks in advance, any other guidance about a potential productivity sink in the coming months?
I would not recommend banning any kind of political speech at work, because some of the issues that come up in this election may have impact on people at work. So I wouldn't ban speech, and also because you cannot control what people talk about as the leader. I think it's also fair to remind people that they have goals at work and productivity. If something is destructive to productivity, then it's probably and not relevant to work. It's probably taking up too much of people's time. And I don't know, maybe people found the Olympics were a productivity hit at work. Like, I don't know. Sometimes stuff that's happening in the world does create a productivity hit, and sometimes you need to deal with it, and other times you need to say, we're done. We need to get back to work. So I don't know. What do you all think? Where would you draw the line?
I have to say, I thought the Olympics was like a joy add in the workshops that I did. It was a really great connection point because I said, oh, what's your favorite thing you're watching and why?
Mm-hmm.
And it was a really nice way to kind of, I think in a time where people do feel like the lack of common, human connection, it was just such a great way to bring people together. Now, I don't know if people were watching 10 hours a day of sharpshooting. I can't say, but at least at the top of a workshop, it was an ad. Jason?
I think you're getting at like this idea of like when do you move on? So there's the boundary of like what are we going to talk about or not talk about, and then there's the boundary of like, let's say we've decided to engage in a conversation. At what point do we decide that should be over? That we need to move on. There's other stuff that we need to accomplish, and I think we're tempted to think of this so differently than other things. But to your point, Kim, like if there was this isn't exactly a thing that happened, but if you could imagine, again, I'll just, since it's another common, although not universal experience, but if you could imagine a group of people creating a parenting Slack channel, and then all of a sudden that Slack channel becomes so contentious that it's like, it's taking up all of people's time. And you say like, hey, I understand that we're passionate about this. We have different perspectives. This isn't relevant to like, it's not critical for us to have this discussion at work, or at least not during work hours. So I'm going to ask you all to stop doing that and focus on get back to work. And I think politics is the same thing. At some point, it becomes very clear that this is no longer productive or helpful. It's not building relationships. It's not moving the ball forward on the work. And so we need to put that aside and focus on work stuff.
I'll give you a case study. And this is a long ago and far away election. But when I worked at Google, there was one point when we did the funny thing of the weekend. So everybody would on Monday morning, I'd have a staff meeting and I'd invite everybody to tell a funny story from the weekend. And that particular week, my funny story from the weekend was the Saturday Night Live skit. I can see Russia from my house,
I remember that one.
Okay, so I had a particular point of view.
Some of our listeners might not
why don't
know
you,
the reference.
Yeah, bring
well, I know I'm thinking Sarah Palin, but Jason, you have a better memory than I do. So,
that's what it was. Yeah, we'll find a link to it for the show notes.
Okay.
Yeah. Which I thought was funny. And in fact, it was fun. Everybody thought it was funny. But there was this is the team where there was one person on the team who was much more conservative. And he said to me later, it was funny. And it assumed that everybody in the room agreed and shared a particular point of view. And that made me feel excluded. And so I took that seriously. And I tried to find an equally funny video that showed the other point of view. Voting, I don't even remember this. What year was this? Anyway.
Unimportant.
2008.
So who was the other? It was 2000. Who was the other vice presidential candidate? So who's running again?
I think it was
Sarah Palin. And
no, it's Joe Biden.
I think it was Joe Biden.
Okay,
so that's why I was like, I don't want to.
So it wasn't that long ago and far away. So I tried to find one that mocked Joe Biden. So again, and that's not like both sidesism. It was about making everyone in the room feel included. So, but I don't know how should I have handled that? Should I not have shown the funny Saturday Night Live skit? Like, what do you think?
It's hard because it's humor. I think the risk with humor is always that like someone feels like they're sort of being punched. It's punching down.
Well, and that was what this person felt was exactly like I don't have a right to have my belief. And in fact, when my boss is sharing her political beliefs, like that felt very threatening to him.
Yeah, and when your political beliefs are especially like they're the punchline to the joke, I think you violated your own don't essentialize. You know what I'm saying? Like that not everybody's going to find this funny because of the
essentializing though. I mean, it was just making fun of Sarah Palin. I think it was assuming, but not essentializing.
Okay.
Brandy has an ad.
It was a clip made that it was Hillary Clinton and Sarah Palin, and they were making fun of both candidates. And parody is accepted among all parties. The line that everybody remembers is they were talking about foreign policy, and Tina Fey says, "And I can see Russia from my house." There are also plenty of jabs at Hillary Clinton, who was played by Amy Poehler.
Yes, but I didn't show any of those.
Oh, you showed
when I showed
the Palin one.
I showed the clip. I just showed the one clip.
Yes. I think if you had played the entire clip, that would have been different.
Yeah, then it would have been fine. But I did not.
Okay, that's a good clarification.
That I thought was funny. Yes. So I don't think it was essentializing anybody, but it was assuming that everybody in the room had the same political beliefs, and that one was funny and the rest was not worth showing, right? And that I think was what was problematic with what I did.
Yeah, and what I would say is like the other guidance that we talked about is to be open to other people's point of view, and I think you were in the conversation after
I got the feedback. I was open, but I was not before I got the feedback.
Correct. You didn't consider that other people might have a different point of view and might not find it as funny. And I think like that, from my perspective, like that's part of the calculus. When I think about having political discussions, either with people at work or people in my life, is like, do I think the person that I'm going to have this conversation with is going to feel like that their time is well spent in that discussion, right? Do they feel,
Yes.
is it going to come across as a sign of respect for that other person that I'm willing to have this discussion with them? Or is it going to come across as an annoyance? Like,
Yeah.
Am I going to be pissing this person off?
Yeah. Are you picking a fight or building a relationship?
I think that's the best simplification. And I think that, to me, like that's the calculus that we should all that we should all do when it comes to any topic at work that is not directly work related. I mean, even the stuff that's work related, like, don't pick fights. This is good advice.
Well, Jason, as you were saying that, it was making me think of, like, before people go into these, feedback conversations, and you think, oh, this person knows exactly what I'm talking about, and they have no idea what we're talking about. We make so many assumptions that they're looking at it just the same way that we are. So I think that, lack of making assumptions and being open to the possibility someone might see it differently. All right. So let's move on to our tips. Before we do, just one final note. We have put in the show notes the actual clip we were just talking about, where, in fact, according to Brandy, they were making fun of both Hillary Clinton and Sarah Palin. Kim only showed the clip about Tina Fey as Sarah Palin. Let's get into our radical candor checklist and start putting radical candor into practice.
Tip number 1, even if you don't agree about abortion or healthcare or gun control, don't judge the success of a conversation on whether you change the other person's mind or they change your mind. You just have to be willing to hear the issues from the other person's perspective. So if you've decided to engage, be open to the other person's perspective and express your point of view with respect and clarity, all the while not losing sight of the fact that you actually like this person that you're talking to. And that's why you're having the discussion with them in the first place.
Tip number 2, you can believe whatever you want, but you cannot impose your beliefs on others. So remember that there's a boundary between what you believe and your right to impose it on others. So make sure that you understand where that boundary is in your organization, and that you're clear in your own mind about when you are expressing a belief and when you may be imposing a belief on others.
Tip number 3, building on Kim's tip, especially when we're managers, it is so important to recognize that in our workplace, we've got a diversity of opinions and lived experiences. And so it's up to us to foster an environment where everyone feels safe to express themselves without fear of retaliation or judgment. And it's so important to establish clear boundaries to ensure that personal expressions are voluntary, meaning that no one should feel pressured to participate or share their views. So we want to encourage open dialogue, but only amongst those who feel comfortable engaging in such discussions.
And tip number 4, when in doubt, ask yourself, am I picking a fight or am I building a relationship? Sometimes the most important thing to do when we're considering discussing politics at work is to stop ourselves and make sure that the person that we want to talk to about it is a willing participant.
For more tips, check out our YouTube channel. And you can not only listen to this podcast, but watch dozens of other Radical Candor videos. Show notes for this episode are at radicalcandor.com/podcast. Praise in public and criticize in private. So if you like what you hear, please go ahead and rate and review us wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you've got criticism, please do email it to podcast@radicalcandor.com. Bye for now.
Take care, everyone.
See ya.
The Radical Candor podcast is based on the book Radical Candor, Be a Kick-Ass Boss Without Losing Your Humanity by Kim Scott. Episodes are written and produced by Brandy Neal with script editing by me, Amy Sandler. The show features Radical Candor co-founders Kim Scott and Jason Rosoff and is hosted by me, still Amy Sandler. Nick Carissimi is our audio engineer. The Radical Candor podcast theme music was composed by Cliff Goldmacher. Follow us on LinkedIn, Radical Candor the company, and visit us at radicalcandor.com.